Do you believe that even nature itself can protect a house in unexpected ways? Imagine the scene. A thief who, motivated by greed, decides to break into a vacation cabin in Colorado, thinking that there he will find valuables that are easy to pick up. But what he did not imagine is that when he opened the attic, he would not find jewelry or gold, but a giant and scary nest of marimbondos. What seemed to be a robbery opportunity turned into an immediate nightmare, a brutal battle between that invader and a force of nature that is not usually so visible. Have you ever been in a situation where expectation was completely destroyed by something else entirely? Stay with me until the end, because this story reveals that sometimes the greatest guardian of a house is precisely in the secrets it keeps, and what happened that day in Colorado may surprise you. That hut, isolated in the mountain, seemed like a quiet refuge, but it hid a secret that no thief could imagine. When the invader decided to open the attic, nothing of material value came to light, but a surprise that would change everything. A gigantic nest of marimbondos, a real fortress of stings and poison. The reaction was instantaneous and brutal. The insects perceived the threat and attacked with a ferocity that few could have predicted, leaving the criminal completely disoriented and desperate. He tried to escape, jumping out of the window in an attempt to escape from that raging army. What happened next with the fall, the chase into the forest, and the outcome of that day is something that defies logic and shows that in nature there are forces that we cannot always understand or control. Not even the boldness of a thief, accustomed to violating property, was enough to overcome the natural defense of that hut. The neighboring residents, hearing the screams of agony echoing on the mountain, were perplexed by what had happened. When the police arrived at the scene, what they found was a scene of complete destruction. A wounded man covered in stings, the victim of a natural defense that looked like something out of an adventure movie. This story quickly spread, becoming an example that nature often keeps its most dangerous secrets and that she does not hesitate to protect her homes from invaders. But what exactly happened that day? And what will be the lesson we can take from it all? Stay with me, because the next part will reveal surprising details of this unusual adventure in Colorado. If you found this story incredible, just imagine what could happen to someone who actually tries to break into such a property without knowing what is behind the doors and walls. Stories like this make us reflect on how much nature has its own defense mechanisms, often silent, but extremely effective. And thinking about it, I want to know from you, have you ever been through any unusual or even scary situation involving nature or someone trying to invade your space? Share here in the comments your opinion or that experience that marked you in some way. Your participation is essential for this channel to continue growing and bringing content that connects real stories with important lessons. If this topic touched you or made you think, be sure to like the video. Your like is a force that encourages the production of more stories like this, which show that often the greatest guardian of a house or a space is precisely what we cannot see immediately. And of course, if you want to follow more amazing stories, tips, and reflections like this, subscribe to the channel. Thus, you stay on top of everything and help spread this message of respect and admiration for the force of nature. Your participation here is what makes this content reach more people, creating a community that values real stories and learning. So stay with me, because there is still much more to come on this journey full of surprises and lessons, always keeping an eye on the connection between the human and the natural. It was a quiet afternoon in the mountains of Colorado, where the wind whispered among the trees and the sky had a deep blue hue, tinged by the cold air typical of the region. Sunlight filtered through the dense crowns of the trees, creating shadow patterns that danced on the ground, covered with dry leaves and scattered branches. The secluded and simple-looking holiday cottage seemed to be completely unoccupied at that moment. Its windows reflected the glare of the sun, and all around nature seemed to rest in almost magical tranquility. For those who passed by, it was just another building forgotten by the hectic routine of the cities, a rest house abandoned until then, which was silently waiting for someone who could enjoy it again. However, for an individual with different intentions, that same cabin turned into a perfect opportunity. The thief, accustomed to the routine of invasions and thefts, saw in that scenario an ease. The absence of residents, the poorly protected door, and the fact that he was far from any immediate surveillance encouraged him to act quickly. His goal was clear: to break in, grab valuables and disappear before anyone noticed his presence. He had basic hacking experience, knew the risks, but he also knew that most of the time luck favored those who chose unprotected targets, especially in remote locations where surveillance was almost non-existent. As he approached the hut with silent steps, the silence of the landscape seemed even more intense, as if all that tranquility was hiding something. The thief examined the structure, checking for signs of vulnerability, a broken window, a poorly closed door, or any loophole that would facilitate its entry. Everything seemed in his favor. Carefully, he managed to open one of the windows without making a sound and entered the hut. His eyes darted quickly through the surroundings, searching for valuables or something that could be easily sold. The feeling of expectation was mixed with a subtle anxiety, typical of those who know that they can be caught at any moment, but also fueled by the desire to get something that justified the risk. Inside, the atmosphere was absolute silence, broken only by the sound of his own breathing and the soft footsteps. The wooden walls and plank floor creaked a little, adding to the sense of isolation of that structure. The thief quickly rummaged through the interior, looking for jewelry, money, or electronics that might be worth something. However, as he moved through the rooms, he realized that this place had something more than simple forgotten objects. It was a holiday cottage, yes, but also a space that seemed to hold stories, memories, and secrets, something that at that moment he had no way of imagining. When I went up to the attic, the expectation reached the apex. His intention was to find a chest with money or a jewelry box, something that justified the risk of invading that refuge. But upon opening the door of the hidden space, his life changed dramatically. Instead of gold or money, he came across a giant and frightening nest of marimbondos, an immense colony of insects that spread throughout the ceiling structure. It was a stunning, almost surreal sight that seemed straight out of a thriller. The small insects, with their vibrant colors and menacing bodies, quickly realized the presence of the invader, and without hesitation, attacked with a ferocity that he had never imagined. What was supposed to be a simple invasion turned into a desperate fight for survival, and it all happened in a matter of seconds, changing the fate of that man that day on the mountain. The invader, realizing the intensity of the marimbondos' attack, instinctively retreated, his steps becoming more hesitant as he tried to move away from that nightmare of stings and incessant movement. But despite the fright and pain that was beginning to spread through his body, his initial confidence still remained, although now somewhat shaken. He believed that with a little luck, he would be able to escape from this situation without major consequences. Adrenaline propelled his movements, and with a mixture of fear and determination, he turned to search for an escape route. Still not realizing the extent of what he had gotten himself into, he decided he needed to get out of that place as soon as possible, as the threat of the insects only seemed to increase. He checked around, looking for an easy way out, a window or a door that could be opened without making too much noise. The hut, with its wooden walls and tiled ceiling, looked like a maze of obstacles, each corner hiding a more unpleasant surprise than the previous one. The plank floor creaked under his feet, and every movement seemed to amplify the chaos around him. Even as the fear grew, his mind still insisted on an idea that everything could be solved with some quick strategy. He leaned on the hope that if he could make it to the front door, he would be able to escape that nightmare, perhaps even without realizing the true force of nature he had faced. He forced open the iron door, which creaked as it slowly opened, and entered the main room. His eyes scanned the environment, looking for any object that could facilitate his escape or perhaps protect him from a new onslaught of insects. That moment felt like a battle of resistance, a race against time to evade the attack that seemed to have no end. Every step was thought out, every move carefully planned, as if playing a high-stakes game. His confidence, fueled by the desire to survive, drove him to keep going, even with his body already scarred by stings and pain. What he had not realized, however, was that the true strength of that hut went far beyond its physical structure or its appearance of refuge. The force that resided there was invisible, silent, but relentless in its ability to protect what belonged to it. And at that moment, the intruder was about to discover this in a way he could never have imagined. The sense of security he had when invading that place would soon turn into a brutal lesson about the limits of human arrogance in the face of the forces that nature reserves. His initial confidence, though strong, was slowly being replaced by the impact of a hidden truth that had been revealed in a rather cruel and unexpected way. That man's journey, marked by thoughtless decisions and a posture that seemed invincible, now faced a challenge that went far beyond his ability to steal objects. It was a battle of survival, of respect for the forces of life that are often not visible to the eye, but that manifest in ways that change destinies in a matter of seconds. And as he tried to recover from the shock and pain, one thing was certain. What seemed like an ordinary invasion had become a real lesson in humility. But even then, the way back still seemed far away, and the connection with the force of nature that had been awakened that day remained shrouded in mystery and surprise. After narrowly escaping the attack of the marimbondos, the invader, still dizzy and with his skin burning from hundreds of stings, began to pull himself together. Despite the pain, his survival instinct spoke louder, and he knew he needed to act quickly to get rid of that natural nightmare. With a racing heart, he turned to examine the inside of the hut, trying to understand what else might be hidden in that place that looked like a trap set by the forest itself. His eyes rummaged through every detail. Antique furniture, old paintings, stacked boxes and drawers locked or simply forgotten by time. Every corner seemed to hide a secret, a story that could be worth a fortune, or at least something that justified the risk of invading that refuge. The feeling that something valuable might be there fueled his hope, as his trembling fingers rummaged through the drawers, pulling out forgotten objects and examining everything carefully. But deep down, he knew that the greatest reward was not something material, but the feeling that he had managed to enter a forbidden territory, a space that seemed to keep the essence of that isolated place. It was then that his eyes were fixed on a wooden staircase, half hidden behind a bookcase. It looked old, with steps worn out by use and time, but for him this was an opportunity, a chance to find out what could be hidden in the attic, a kind of last hurdle before reaching what in your head could be a real goldmine. Without hesitation, he approached and put his hand on the wooden ladder, feeling the weight and stability of that structure that seemed to stand the test of time. His heart raced even faster as a mixture of anxiety and adrenaline washed over him. Every step he took to climb seemed like a decision that could define his fate that day. The feeling that something important would be there, hidden in that secret space, increased the expectation. His mind, full of dreams and plans, tried to imagine what he might find up there, whether it would be a box of money, jewelry, or something more valuable than anything he could imagine. The hope of a great discovery drove him, and his will to take advantage of that moment became stronger and stronger. However, as his feet touched the steps, a silent doubt crept into his head. Would it really be worth risking everything for an object or a hope that could only be an illusion? Even with this doubt, the determination to reach the top prevailed. He climbed up slowly, carefully, so as not to make any noise or reawaken any insects that might be lurking in the shadows of the attic. When he finally reached the top, the sight that opened up before him was astonishing. The space was smaller than he had imagined, filled with boxes of aged wood, covered with dust and objects that seemed to belong to a life that had already passed. Each item had its story, but nothing seemed really flashy or valuable. Still, his hope remained alive, fueled by the idea that maybe something was hidden inside that would change everything. He began to explore that space more meticulously, rummaging through boxes and pulling objects carefully, as if he could discover an ancient secret at any moment. The atmosphere seemed charged with silence, but also with expectation. Every move, every discovery felt like a piece of a puzzle he needed to piece together to understand what that place really held. The feeling that something bigger was coming propelled him to keep going, even though hope was beginning to mix with tiredness and doubt. After all, what else could be hidden in that attic? Perhaps a box of old coins, a reliquary of sentimental value, or even some memory of a past life forgotten by time. But at that moment, all that seemed little in the face of the great revelation that he had not yet encountered. And despite all the anxiety, one thing was certain: he was not going to give up so easily, because the hope of a great discovery still pulsed strong within him, fueled by the impact of everything that had happened so far. When opening the attic lid, a completely unexpected scene revealed itself before the eyes of the invader. He believed that by pulling out that box or opening that drawer, he would find something valuable, or at the very least, a surprise that would justify his invasion. But what was inside was much more than he could have imagined. A gigantic nest of marimbondos, an intricate structure of tiny bodies, sharp stingers, and an impressive amount of insects that seemed to be on a mission of total defense. The colony, which occupied the entire length of the ceiling of the space, vibrated with an energy of menace that he had never witnessed before. The noise that came when opening the lid was abrupt, a mixture of buzzing, rapid movements, and a sense of impending danger that cut through the air like a blade. The sight of that swarm was like a crack in his head, a hidden truth that nature herself guarded with rigor. The movement of the marimbondos was almost instantaneous. As if awakened by an invisible signal, they rushed out of the nest with frightening speed, forming a menacing cloud that seemed to want to swallow everything around. The individual, who had hitherto had a countenance of audacity, found himself surrounded by a force of nature which he could not control. The swarm's fury was like an avalanche of stings which came from all sides, hitting his body with an intensity that seemed electric. The pain was almost unbearable, a sharp burning that spread to arms, face, neck, and even hands. His cries of despair echoed through the enclosed space as he tried to retreat, but the insect's movement was relentless. Each marimbondo, with its black and yellow-striped body, seemed to be guided by a single mission: to protect its home at any cost. In this moment of chaos, everything happened very quickly. His wide eyes searched for a way out, any escape route that might lessen the attack or at least prevent the worst. But the number of insects was so great that it seemed like a coordinated attack force, a real onslaught of pure natural aggressiveness. He tried to swing his arms, kick, run, but the barrage of stings did not give respite. Each blow against the insect seemed only to intensify the fury of the swarm, which was ruthless in its defense. The feeling of helplessness seized the invader, who, in the midst of that whirlwind of pain and despair, realized that he had made a fatal mistake. By thinking that he could simply open the space without consequences, he had awakened a force that he could not tame. And the worst thing was that, in his blindness, he still insisted on running, desperately trying to escape from that attack that seemed endless. As the adrenaline mixed with the pain, he began to realize that it was not just a matter of running away, but of surviving that brutal impact of nature itself. Every move, every attempt to hide or to reach a way out, seemed like a battle against an invisible force, which did not accept invasions. His cries of pain and dread echoed throughout the hut, as he tried with trembling hands to protect his face and eyes from the well-aimed blows of the swarm. That moment became a kind of endurance test, a proof that no matter how much the human being thinks he is in control, nature always reserves its own surprises. And, in that instant, that truth was clearer than ever, leaving a lesson of humility and respect for forces that are beyond human understanding. Everything happened in a fraction of seconds, but the marks of that impact would remain for a long time in the memory of that man. When he finally managed to pull away, what was left was a destroyed figure, scarred by hundreds of stings, with a swollen body and red skin, burning with pain. Still, the biggest wound was not the one visible on the skin, but the one that had been opened in his mentality, in his perception that the force of nature does not confront itself in any way. The impact of that day would resonate for far longer than any object he might have tried to steal. After all, the greatest revelation of that moment was that the true power of that place was not in material things, but in the wild and untamed essence that life itself reserves, ready to awaken when it is least expected. And while the cloud of insects still buzzed around him, he realized painfully that he had awakened a hidden truth, a force that could never be controlled or underestimated. In a matter of seconds, everything changed dramatically. The invader, who until then had been desperately trying to get away from the marimbondos, found himself surrounded by a mass of insects that were advancing with frightening speed. The humming intensified, creating a kind of deafening chorus that seemed to echo through his ears as a wave of black and yellow bodies moved quickly towards him. Each marimbondo seemed guided by a defense force that admitted no retreat, a true natural armada that had no intention of sparing anyone who dared to invade its protected space. The man screamed, his voice choked with panic, trying to move away at the same speed as the insects approached. His steps became uncoordinated, almost a clumsy race against the avalanche of stings that threatened to consume him at any moment. He tried to jump out of the window, hoping to escape from that brutal and sudden attack. The escape was swift, almost instinctive, a desperate attempt to save one's own skin from what felt like a storm of pain and destruction. The inevitable fall was painful and clumsy, leaving him injured, his eyes wide and his body reeling from the impact. Even on the ground, the chaos did not cease. The marimbondos, tireless, continued to pursue him, invading the surrounding space, hitting him with a ferocity that bordered on the sacred. Each bite felt like a mark of resistance, a proof that that swarm would not rest while it was on its course of destruction. The feeling of powerlessness took over, a mixture of physical pain, fear, and a sense of being consumed by a force I could not comprehend or defeat. That scene of despair unfolded in the vastness of that open ground, as the man tried unsuccessfully to protect himself from the stings and flee at the same time. His movements were increasingly uncoordinated, his breathing heavy and cut off by the rarefied mountain air. Cries of pain echoed through the valleys, getting lost in the vastness of the surrounding forest, as the insects continued their relentless onslaught. It was a struggle for survival, a battle between a human being trying to escape and an uncontrollable force of nature that defended its space with an almost blind ferocity. Every step, every attempt to hide or reach a tree, seemed futile in the face of that stinging army that gave no respite. At that moment, the feeling that everything could end there, in that instant, was almost palpable. Pain, fear, hopelessness, mixed in an explosive mixture that made the invader question his own decisions. How can anyone underestimate the strength of something so small and seemingly fragile? How could an insect colony turn a seemingly controllable attack into a life-or-death battle? These questions ran through his head as he tried, with effort, to ward off the biggest attack he had ever faced in his life. Each movement was a struggle against the body itself, which began to weaken, and against the natural force that seemed to be a real weapon of defense of those creatures. And even with all the pain and fatigue, he knew he had to keep going, because stopping meant accepting defeat in the face of something that at that moment seemed stronger than anything he could imagine. The pursuit showed no signs of stopping. The marimbondos, guided by their wild nature, continued to follow the invader until they reached the forest that surrounded the hut. That space of tall trees and deep shadows turned into a kind of battlefield, where the man, already almost out of strength, tried to hide behind logs, protect himself with his hands, and breathe with difficulty. Each step in the vegetation was an attempt to recover, but also a risk of being struck by a fatal sting. The forest, with its density and darkness, seemed a temporary protection, a refuge that could be salvation or a new danger. His mind, confused by suffering and adrenaline, was looking for a way out, a strategy to escape from that hell of stings. I knew that even though I was injured, I couldn't stop, because the impact of it all was yet to be fully felt. Every heavy breath, every drop of sweat mixed with blood, showed that the battle was not over yet, and that emotional, physical, and even psychological impact would lead him on a journey of transformation that he could not yet comprehend. As the man struggled to escape the brutal onslaught of the marimbondos, the silence of the mountain was suddenly broken by high-pitched, desperate screams that echoed through the surrounding trees and valleys. Those screams of pain and dread, charged with an almost supernatural intensity, quickly spread through the local community, causing nearby residents to stop their tasks and look in the direction of that mess. Some, frightened by the volume and frequency of the screams, immediately ran in the direction of the sound, while others, more cautious, preferred to be attentive, listening to every detail of that dramatic scene that seemed like something out of a thriller. It was as if nature itself was trying to communicate something serious, a kind of silent warning that what was happening there had a force that went beyond common understanding. Among the witnesses were people who were in their usual routines, tending to the garden or talking on the balcony, and who suddenly turned around when they heard the screams coming closer and closer. Some were frightened when they realized the intensity of the situation, while others, moved by a curiosity that mixed fear, decided to follow the sound, slowly walking along the trail that led to the hut. The scene they found there was something they could hardly imagine. A man wounded, his face contorted with pain, was trying to crawl in the direction of the forest, while a cloud of marimbondos was still stirring around him, forming a kind of circle of chaos and destruction. Their cries of agony echoed among the trees, almost as a denunciation that natural force did not accept invasions or disrespect. Some residents, as they got closer, gasped at that scene of pure resistance. The sight of the man covered with stings, staggering and trying to escape, seemed a symbol of a disproportionate struggle against an invisible enemy, which had manifested itself in such a brutal form. Others, with a heavy heart, saw the scene up close, while trying to understand what could have caused such a reaction from the insects. At that moment, the narrative of that day was unfolding before attentive eyes, giving a greater dimension to the emotional impact and the hidden truth behind that attack. It was as if the mountain itself was witnessing an ancient battle, a history of defense that seemed to have suddenly reactivated without warning. Those who were closest realized the intensity of the situation and, without hesitation, called the local police. Calls were made urgently while residents tried to calm the injured man who, despite suffering, still tried to communicate something. The concern was visible in the expression of everyone, who wondered to what extent nature could be an ally or an enemy, depending on the point of view. The report of the neighbors who heard the screams also brought important details: the way the invader screamed and struggled, the sound of stings that sounded like a rain of needles, and the chaotic scene that unfolded there in the forest. Each witness had his own version, but they all agreed that this was something beyond the ordinary, a clear manifestation that natural balance often only reveals itself in its wildest and truest form when someone tries to disrespect it. The atmosphere of fear and surprise was mixed with the feeling that something bigger had happened there. The residents, as they gathered in the square of the small community, commented on the strength of the insects, the courage of the man, and the lesson that this episode could leave. Everyone knew that no matter how unbelievable the story seemed, it had a veracity that could not be disregarded, a proof that the impact of a reckless action on nature could be devastating. From that moment on, the concern was not only with the state of the invader, but also with the message that the earth itself wanted to convey, that it keeps its secrets, its forces, and its limits, and that when disrespected, it responds in a way that often leaves deep marks on the conscience of those who dare to challenge its essence. And as silence began to re-establish itself on the mountain, residents reflected on the importance of respecting behind-the-scenes wildlife, understanding that what you don't often see is what really keeps the world in balance. When police finally arrived on the scene they found was almost like a scene from a horror movie. The man, exhausted and completely covered with stings, lay slumped on the forest floor, his body marked by red and swollen marks, indelible signs of that brutal attack. His eyes were wide with pain and a fear that seemed to have turned into a definite lesson. The intensity of the episode, which felt like a disproportionate battle between a natural force and an unsuspecting invader, reinforced the message that nature, no matter how quiet and discreet it may seem, has its own guardians and limits. And these limits, when crossed, can turn into inevitable consequences which leave physical and emotional marks that are difficult to erase. The impact of this incident was immediate in the local community. News spread like wildfire through dry brush, and the report became symbolic of a lesson few were willing to learn in practice. After all, even the most cynical had to recognize that the strength of wildlife is something that is not underestimated, that is not controlled by willpower or arrogance. The impact of that day served to reinforce the idea that, by challenging the limits of what is natural, human beings are at serious risk of suffering the consequences. This story has become a kind of alert, a reminder that our decisions, however minor they may seem, have their repercussions on the impact of everything around us, and often this impact is a hard lesson which is not easily forgotten. The episode also sparked a deeper reflection on the backstage of this relationship between man and nature. Why do we often insist on challenging that which is stronger than we imagine? What is the impact of our actions on the transformation journey we all live? The hidden truth behind that attack is that life does not accept invasions without a proportional response. And most of the time, this answer comes from sources that we can't even imagine, such as a colony of marimbondos, who by defending their space reveal a strength that can turn moments of arrogance into lessons in humility. It is a kind of revelation that forces us to rethink our decisions, our limits, and above all, our mentality before the natural world. By the end of the episode, it was clear that the consequence was inevitable. There was no denying that, by trying to invade a space that was not his own, that man had awakened a force that, in its essence, is one of the oldest and most respected, the defense of life. And this defense often manifests itself in unexpected ways, which reveal themselves only after a direct collision. His story became a narrative of impact, which echoed throughout the region, reinforcing the idea that the true journey of transformation begins when we understand that our actions leave marks and that, deep down, everything is connected to the invisible forces that sustain the balance of the planet. What remained beyond the physical wounds was a deeper understanding that respect for life is the best way to prevent our arrogance from leading to irreversible consequences. This reflection, which is born from such a simple episode, reveals that the hidden truth often lies in the actions we take without thinking about the repercussions. And by understanding that the impact of a decision can be greater than we imagine, we begin to realize that every transformation journey goes through this understanding. It is a lesson that, in essence, talks about respect, humility, and connection with the world around us, remembering that our choices shape not only who we are, but also the impact we leave on life. And in this case, it is certain that the lesson has been learned, in a perhaps painful but effective way. The strength of wildlife is not something that is challenged without paying a price. This story has become a symbol of poetic justice, a reminder that life often responds in a way that no one can predict, but which in essence always seeks to balance our actions. That man who tried to break into the cabin was defeated, not by some legal punishment, but by the marimbondos of fate, who showed that the force of nature is not challenged without consequences. It is a reminder that our decisions carry impact, often hidden beneath the surface, waiting for the moment to manifest. That lesson, though harsh, reinforces the idea that true transformation happens when we learn to respect the behind-the-scenes of life, the invisible processes that sustain the balance of everything around us. And this story, more than a simple episode, becomes an invitation to reflect on our own journey, on the decisions we make on a daily basis, and how they can trigger profound revelations that change the course of our lives. Often, we are so focused on our goals, on achieving what we desire, that we forget to observe the impact of our actions on our own lives and those around us. That invader, for example, believed that he could simply take whatever he wanted without thinking about the consequences. And in his arrogance, he ended up a victim of his own ignorance. The impact of that episode was a lesson that life has its own protective mechanisms, and that they work in a way that, no matter how hard we try to control it, will always have an answer that puts us in our rightful place. It is not just about punishment, but about a learning opportunity, a chance to realize that our actions do not happen in isolation, but are part of a great system where everything has its time, its space, and its own balancing forces. This understanding is fundamental for those who seek a true transformation, because it leads us to see beyond the surface, to unveil the hidden truth behind events, and thus evolve in our mentality. When we reflect on all this, we see that the journey of growth involves accepting that not everything is under our control, that there are invisible forces at work behind the scenes, often silently but always present. And by understanding this concept, we begin to develop a more mature, more conscious mindset. We learn that our decisions carry weight, that every step we take influences not only our path, but also the impact we leave on the world. That episode in Colorado reveals that true strength lies not in daring to defy nature, but in the humility to recognize its limits and to act with respect and wisdom. It is a lesson that, if assimilated, can transform our way of facing life, helping us to build a journey more aligned with our values and with the universe that surrounds us. Deep down, it all shows that no matter how hard we try to control the unknown, there is a greater wisdom in accepting our vulnerability. And this acceptance, at the same time, is a source of strength, because it teaches us to act more consciously, to respect the behind-the-scenes of life, and to recognize that often the deepest impact comes from simple actions that we do with intention or without it. When we look at this story and realize the strength of fate's marimbondos, we can understand that the universe likes to charge in subtle but effective ways. Thus, we learn that true transformation happens when we can see beyond the surface, when we take our share of responsibility in our decisions, and above all, when we begin to respect the invisible forces that shape our path. After all, life always has a way of charging, whether through wounds, lessons, or revelations that change the course of our history. And in this process, we discover that the greatest strength lies in our ability to learn, adapt, and evolve. If you have come this far, I want to thank you for following this story and reflecting along with me on what it teaches us. It is interesting to see how nature knows how to protect its spaces in a way that we often do not even imagine. and how our actions can trigger reactions that go beyond what we can predict. These lessons show us that respect and humility are essential in living with the world around us, and that often the greatest learning comes from difficult moments that put us in our place. If this content made you think, it is the invitation for you to subscribe to the channel. Here we always seek to bring stories and reflections that help us see the world in a more conscious way and connected with the forces that surround us. Also, we love to know your opinion, so leave a comment below saying that I'm with you until the end, or some message that shows that you followed up until the last second. Thus, we create a closer exchange, and it is easier to continue delivering content that makes sense to you. And of course, if this topic was interesting, there is a video next to it that complements this story, so click there and continue with me there. Thus, we can explore together even more these encounters between the human and the natural, always thinking about learning and evolving with what life has to offer us.